effects of all the head injuries, and we also have the idea that he's no longer having major depressions, because he would tend to be switching from depression to mania. That was his pattern, not the other way around.
So, I want to chat with you a little bit about your ultimate conclusion in this case, and go back to the test for insanity in a criminal case. And so,
Which term are you using?
sorry?
I can't see
Oh,
it.
sorry.
Okay.
Just the statutory definition.
Yeah.
So a person is not responsible for criminal conduct if at the time of such conduct, in the first prong, as a result of a mental disease or defect. And so you believe that Mr. Bourgoin had a mental disease?
I do.
And what was your diagnosis?
He had bipolar disorder with psychotic features, rapid cycling, meaning a certain number of episodes per year. That was his diagnosis.
And that, we've spent now almost a full day talking about the evidence that supports that diagnosis.
Yes.
And with regard to the second prong, you believe that he lacked the adequate capacity either to, let's start with first, do you believe he could appreciate the criminality of his conduct?
No.
And why not? Summary for him.
He did not intend to go the wrong direction and kill people or kill himself. He did not intend that. He was doing the same thing he had been doing for 2 days, which is driving around frantically, trying to preserve his life, trying to understand what he had to do next to be safe. The last day was primarily about his safety. Were they going to kill him? Were they going to kill Izzy? Were they going to burn down his house? He was trying to be safe, and he was in such a state of psychotic frenzy and confusion, and listening to the directions, his inferences from the radio and lights in the environment, that this is a simple psychotic error, not an intentional act.
And with regard to his ability to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law, do you believe he could do that?
No.
And why not?
Again, he thought his life was in danger. He even thought Lizzie's life was in danger. He was doing what he thought he had to do to preserve his life, to be safe, and again, at times toggling into what he thought he had to do to meet the requirements of the, I'll say, government in quotes, to do what he had to do. And so he was sort of psychotically coerced of fear of his psychosis into doing those acts, which is turning around in an unorganized way, following these directions that he thought were taking him the proper direction, driving around, just as he had done without any accidents for the prior few days.
And again, to summarize, in your opinion, do you believe Mr. Bourgoin was suicidal on the night of Saturday, October 8th?
I think there's a lot of evidence against it.
And what would you say were the primary evidence against it?
Well, he was wearing a seatbelt. That's number one. Number two, as we've talked about, he had made all these efforts to avoid being injured. He had, thrown his new cell phone and smashed up his new cell phone. He had guarded his house and slept on the couch the day before because he thought they were going to come burn his house. He had thrown his knife He had bought a pumpkin muffin. Can I just check my notes because I had some other thoughts about that? I'm just blanking for a second.
Refresh your recollection?
Yes.
Review it to yourself, and then refreshes your recollection, you can tell us.
Well, he had been a hypochondriac, and he was afraid of dying, and he told Kapoor, Dr. Kapoor, that he had had so much death in his life, his grandmother, his mother, his father, his dog, his first girlfriend, his very close friend's wife who suicided, that he just couldn't tolerate anymore. He loved his daughter. He would never abandon his daughter. He had never made suicide attempts ever in his whole life, even when depressed. True, he had had some thoughts of death, which is one of the categories for having a major depression, but he had never taken actions to harm himself. And that was when he was depressed. Here he is psychotic and fearing for his life. So I don't think really there's any evidence. And then there was one other piece, which was he was expecting to get $40,000 inheritance from his grandmother. And he had already talked to some people, I think their name was the Feinbergs, and about possibly buying a house in the Rutland area that he could afford. So that's future-oriented thinking. So I think all those reasons are strongly against suicide.
How about, did you see evidence that Mr. Bourgoin was in some type of rage on that evening?
The only times you see him rageful has been with was with Anila. He twice was assaultive to Anila in 2014, 2016. No one observed him to be rageful. He wasn't rageful at the hospital. He was frightened and sort of cuddling under the warm blankets. No one saw him as rageful at all in those several days. He was frightened. He was terrified. He was confused. He was frantic.
We talked about, well, how about, again, with regard to stealing the police car and then when he's unhandcuffed at the side of the road, making an attempt to get up. What's your opinion about whether or not those were escape attempts by Mr. Bourgoin or something else?
So when I watched the videos, what I saw him when he was tied up, he was being hoisted and screaming in pain. And while he was already handcuffed. So that would certainly put a lot of fear into him. He had a hip that was the head of his femur was out of place, and the hip socket was fractured. We call it comminuted into many pieces. I can understand how he's really hurting, besides his head injury and his fractured spine. So he's being hoisted up by his arms, and I saw that on the video. So I can understand why he's afraid of those people who are doing that, including Di Fiore, who called him a dickhead and a piece of shit. I can understand why he was afraid and trying to get away. And consistent with his psychosis is that he's trying to go to the next thing, to get to this female presence that's interacting with him in his psychotic beliefs. That's what he had been doing all along. What's my next task? What do I have to do? This is a man who thought that the accident itself had been staged.
We talked about Dr. Kapoor. Are you aware of what Dr. Kapoor's ultimate opinion is with regard to sanity?
Yes.
And what's her ultimate opinion?
She thought he was insane.
So do you know what her ultimate opinion was with regard to the first prong, mental disease or defect?
Yes.
And what was her opinion?
She thought he had a mixed personality disorder, borderline prominently, and that under stress he had a psychotic deterioration.
And so that's different than your diagnosis?
It is different.
Do both of those count as a mental disease for prong one?
Yes.
So as far as the figuring out whether or not it fits the insanity defense, the difference between you and Dr. Kapoor is not significant.
We both concur.
But what do you, why do you think that Dr. Kapoor, at least with regard to what the mental disease is, it differs from your, why do you differ from her, I guess, is to put it that way? What's the difference between her diagnosis and your diagnosis of mental disease?
Well, I think Dr. Kapoor did a very methodologically excellent job. She testified she entered into, having read my report, she entered into the arrangement with the prosecution as skeptical, and then saw Mr. Bourgoin 3 times for a total of 14 hours, and saw a lot of materials, and would get more materials, and would go back. I think she made a genuine effort. That I don't disagree with her methodology. I think that I was able to elicit more of a mood history than she was. She did elicit a mood history from him about him having hypomanic episodes, but I think she undervalued the evidence about his lack of sleep in the days leading up to it, and I think she undervalued, didn't get as much of a mood history as I obtained. She got some. She seemed to credit it more, and I think she gave more credence to the psychological testing, which showed some aspects of personality disorder. I happen to think that it's unlikely that, it's much more likely that that his psychosis was caused by his mood disorder.
And were you, how did you and Dr. Kapoor align with regard to prong 2 about whether he could appreciate the criminality of his conduct or conform his conduct to the requirements of the law?
Well, I don't know how she broke that down, because I don't think she said that, which 2 she said in her deposition. I just don't recall. I know she opined, she said in the deposition that she thought he was insane, and I don't recall what she said, sub-prong 1 or sub-prong. Of prong 2, which sub-prong she was addressing, or both. I just don't recall what she said.
But what did she think, Dr. Kapoor, did she agree that he was psychotic and delusional?
Yes.
And the lack of the appreciation of his conduct and the conform to the requirements of law are because he was psychotic and delusional?
Yes, she concurred with that.
So how he got there, you guys slightly differ, but that he was in this state, you both agree?
Yes.
And are you, we talked about Dr. Cotton. Have you reviewed materials with regard to Dr. Cotton's ultimate opinion in the case?
I have.
And what's Dr. Cotton's ultimate opinion?
Well, it's sort of internally contradictory.
Well, with regard to sanity at the time of the offense, does he conclude ultimately that he's sane or insane at the time of the offense?
He concludes in a carefully worded statement that he had certain capacities that constitute sanity.
You disagree with Dr. Cotton?
Strongly.
In particular, why do you disagree with Dr. Cotton's either methodology? Well, let's start with his methodology. Do you disagree with his methodology that he took in this case?
In my opinion, it was not up to the standard of care.
And why is that?
Dr. Cotton examined Mr. Bourgoin once for 4 hours. He didn't do a sequential exam. He examined him with a minor amount of materials. When more materials became available, and I had thousands of pages, he didn't review them. He didn't reconsider. He didn't reconsider when he saw my report, subsequent to his, there's no evidence that he didn't watch my interviews. He testified. He didn't watch Dr. Kapoor's interviews, which are data. So I strongly disagree with his methodology. It's a paucity of effort. He doesn't take into account the data. He takes into account his conclusion.
But he did have he did an interview in December of 2016, correct?
Yes.
And then you wrote your report in mid 2018.
January 2018.
January
Excuse me, June 2018.
All right. And so Dr. Cotton certainly had your report before giving his final deposition.
He did.
Okay. So he had reviewed, how long is your report?
62 pages.
And does it include a bunch of excerpts from your interview with Mr. Bourgoin?
Long excerpts of quotations that were transcribed from, not by me, but were transcribed from the videotape that I made.
And you also quoted or summarized many of the collateral sources that you had reviewed prior to writing your report.
I did.
Okay. So Dr. Cotton at least read your report where you had done all the work and done all that stuff, and he reviewed that prior to his final deposition.
Yeah, but it didn't even move him to go back and re-examine the defendant despite having all this stuff.
And so what is your understanding of what Dr. Cotton's at least initial report, what his opinion was in his initial report about Mr. Bourgoin's, not the ultimate conclusion, but his functioning on the evening in question?
I recall his exact words were, reports, by his reports, he may have been delusional. That's pretty close to what he said, maybe exact.
And did Dr. Cotton, in his original report, that was issued back in December 2016, is that your understanding?
Correct.
Did he mention anything in that report or make any finding that Mr. Bourgoin was malingering?
No.
So, in your opinion, how do those two things square? He says he's maybe delusional, he's not malingering, but he's sane at the time. How did Dr. Cotton square those in his original report?
He didn't do it. He didn't square anything. He just said, may have been delusional, doesn't opine that he was suicidal, that he was in a suicide attempt, and just says he, in a long-winded way, he had the capacity to choose to go the wrong way, or words to that effect. And so he doesn't square it, and he doesn't take into account or further investigate the fact about the delusions that even he got early on, much less had reams of evidence from me and Dr. Kapoor subsequently.
And so subsequently, I think you testified to, subsequently, after Dr. Kapoor delivers her opinion to the state, they hire Dr. Cotton. That's your understanding of what happened?
Yes, they hire him as a prosecution witness.
And he's given your report and more materials at that point.
That's my understanding from his deposition.
And then he gives a deposition, and what does Dr. Cotton say at that deposition with regard to malingering?
I don't recall. I'd have to check my notes. Oh, I don't have it in my notes because it was after my notes. I don't recall exactly what he said.
So why, in your opinion then, Dr. Rosemary, is Mr. Bourgoin not malingering or making this all up?
So if you look at the big picture, there's either he was trying to commit suicide and making a big story that he's psychotic this whole time, or he was psychotic. He had no other non-psychotic secondary gain to do what he did, to drive the wrong way, and to he's only alive by luck. It's one of those two. When I examined him, I don't think there's significant evidence that he was suicidal. I think there's a huge amount of evidence that he was grossly psychotic. When he's wearing a seatbelt, all these other things that we talked about when it was not suicidal. When I examined him, his history, the history he gave me, and the history he gave Dr. Kapoor, and the small amount of history that Dr. Cotton investigated, are clinically typical. That is, he has a clinically typical course for the illness I've been describing. The same kind of course I see in people who don't have an accident. The same kind of course that should have landed him in the hospital that morning as he was heading. So his course is clinically typical in non-forensic cases. There's nothing particularly odd about it. Then, when I examine him, one of the things we always look for is, does the defendant sort of lead with exculpating symptoms? Listen, I was really, really psychotic. Right? I was really, really psychotic. I don't get that from him. In fact, if you were on my video and in my recall of my examination, and what I said in deposition was there are times he concentrated mostly about how he wanted to tell me all about how he had suffered in his marriage and wanted to have his child. He's leading with that, and how unfair he felt that he didn't get to see his child for so many times. And I'm having to say, no, I want to hear about this. And I'm cutting him off. I want to hear about what you were thinking when you did this, what was your mood, what was your thoughts. I don't want to hear anything more about the baby. Okay? A couple times. So he's not leading in a way to exculpate him when I'm examining him and when Dr. Kapoor is examining him. He's telling a standard clinical history. Then his manner is that, let me explain this. When he gives his versions to all three of us, they're relatively consistent, but they're not consistent in a practiced manner. So sometimes people are lying to you. In the example we all talk about, President Clinton, very practiced. I did not have sex with that, sexual relations with that woman, like practiced. He gives a consistent story to over a year and a half, 2 years, to all the examiners about the way this thing sort of started out with hints and things that would catch his eye and then blossomed. There are differences. Because that's the way memory is. That's the way memory is after head injuries. That's the way memory gets contaminated. But those are the differences that show honesty as opposed to lying. Because no one remembers something exactly like that that goes over days and days and days. There's variability, but within the variability, it's a generally consistent story of him gradually going from, this is odd, this is peculiar, to, oh my God, I'm in danger. And I'm in danger, or I have this amazing psychotic opportunity. So you see that it's clinically typical, and in his manner of presentation. So those are the main reasons. We also have external reasons that corroborate what he says. So there are things that are indisputable. He was at that stream. And during the time he was at that stream, not another electronic signal came out of his cell phone after he was there for about an hour. For the rest of that cell phone's life, because that cell phone is smashed to pieces and in a stream somewhere. Okay? That's not disputable. So we know, and we know there are times when he was awake. He was awake Saturday morning at 4 o'clock in the morning and over at the Kosovics, and 8 o'clock in the morning, he's at the hospital, and he's confused at the hospital. He's confused trying to get in and out of the parking lot going the wrong direction. All right? He's having trouble driving the right direction in the parking lot, much less getting on an interstate. So we have things that are indisputable that support the version that he gives us. So for all those reasons, I don't think he's lying or faking or malingering.
And do you understand Dr. Kapoor to share that opinion?
I do. She went back to him after she got some of the cell phone and GPS and Facebook materials and examined him and even questioned him about some of that stuff in her third examination.
So to conclude, Dr. Rosemary, what's your opinion of Stephen Bourgoin at the time of the offense with regard to legal insanity?
I thought he was legally insane.
Thank you. I don't have anything else from you.
Okay. Cross.
Thank you, Judge. Good morning, Dr. Rosemary.
Morning, Ms. Dorsch.
Just to recap some of what you spoke about yesterday, the first time that you spoke with Mr. Bourgoin was February of 2018, correct?
Yep.
And that was 16 months after the crashes?
Yes.
And then the second time was April of 2018, correct?
Yes.
And as you've testified, you reviewed a significant amount of Mr. Bourgoin's medical records,
Yes.
medical history. And that included several years of medical records before the crashes, correct?
Yes.
And the only diagnosis in any of those medical records was adjustment disorder, correct?
Adjustment disorder, sometimes I think with mixed depression and anxiety.
Right.
Not
And
just plain adjustment disorder.
he was-
Depression and anxiety.
I hear you. He was diagnosed with that adjustment disorder with potential mixed anxiety or depressed mood on 4 prior occasions.
Well, not potential, just adjustment disorder with depression and anxiety, not potential. That's.
Thank you. 4 prior times?
I didn't count, but that's approximately right.
Well, he was initially diagnosed with it in October of 2014 in out of the Massachusetts Anger Management, correct? You listed that in your report.
Yes.
And then he is given that same diagnosis in 2015 through the UVM behavioral therapy, correct?
Yep.
And then he's diagnosed with that through the UVM Medical Center in May of 2016, correct?
Well, I think the first note of the UVM outpatient records references his having a mood disorder going back to 2010. You don't see those direct records, it's just referenced back to 2010 with his original PCP.
That's the same diagnosis, correct?
Yes, but it goes back to 2010.
And then in December of 2016, 5 weeks after the crashes, Dr. Paul Cotton also diagnoses him with adjustment disorder with mixed disturbance of emotion and conduct.
Well, that's
Correct.
not his only diagnosis.
Can you answer the question?
Okay, that's one of his diagnoses from Dr. Cotton.
Thank you. And about the prior assaults that have been mentioned, you spoke with Mr. Bourgoin about the 2 prior assaults with Ms. Lawrence, correct?
Yes.
And in your direct testimony yesterday, you referred to these prior assaults as the times when she got him into lots of trouble. Is that your recollection?
He said, every time I tried to break up with her, I ended up getting in trouble, or words to that effect.
Okay. And you asked him specifically about the 2014 assault against Ms. Lawrence, right?
I believe he told me he struck her.
And he also
pushed her.
responded that it was a traumatic experience for him, correct?
I don't recall that, but I'll take your word for it.
And you spoke to him specifically about the May 2016 domestic assault and unlawful restraint charge?
Yes.
You said on direct yesterday he assaulted her, at least according to her. You recall that?
I accept your rendition.
But when you asked him in your first interview with him whether he assaulted her, he responded, "I was very angry that day." Do you recall that?
It's probably an accurate quote.
And when you asked him again specifically whether he assaulted her, he stated not intentionally.
I don't recall that, but I accept that I wrote that down as accurate.
And when you asked him again specifically, he elaborated and said, "She got in my way, so I pushed her out of my way." Do you recall that?
Yeah.
And with regards to the threatening to drive them all into the pond, he told you that was only a half-truth. But then when you asked him directly whether he threatened to drive them off the road with all the people in the car, he responded, yes, I did say that.
Well, you're cherry-picking what he said. You're only quoting part of what he said.
Would you like to see the interview again?
I'd be happy to. I recall, and I quoted it in my report, what he said, and he was explaining that, yes, he said that, but he was saying it as a rhetorical advice, saying, now listen, just calm down here. I could be doing this, but of course I'm not. And then they drove around for 45 minutes more, and he thought that as a result of that rhetorical device, things had calmed down enough so he could trust her with the access to the car and the baby, and he can go to the shower. He thought things had calmed down by that time. So it's not merely that he said that, he's the context of what he said that.
I understand that. He told you that he wasn't trying to scare her. He was just trying to imply that he could drive them all off the road into the pond and kill them. But you
I could, but I'm not. Don't
Right.
you see? Why don't you calm down, and we can discuss how I'll have adequate access to my daughter.
And it was your opinion on direct that that was not, you took his word that that was not a real threat.
Well, not only me, Anila's actions indicate that, because Anila goes home with him, right? And then she goes home with him, and then she takes off the car and goes to the police.
Correct.
Right.
So we can take Anila's word for whether or not she took that as a real threat, correct?
Well, she either took it as a threat or as a manipulation to have access to the baby and get him out of the baby's access.
Okay. So you're aware that Mr. Bourgoin in 2018, or I'm sorry, before you interviewed him in 2018, he was interviewed by Ms. Kiley for the defense,
Yes,
and you reviewed that transcript.
yes.
And you can tell from that transcript that Ms. Kiley's the first person who mentions paranoid schizophrenia to Mr. Bourgoin, correct?
I guess so.
And she's also the first person who mentions the possibility of him having a psychotic break.
I guess she did.
And you can tell from that transcript that Ms. Kiley had interviewed him at least one prior time before that, correct?
I think there was some indication in that she'd spoken with him or met with him at the hospital, while he's there. It's not clear. And I didn't interview about that.
And it's not clear because you don't have that interview, correct?
Correct.
And you can tell from the transcript that Mr. Bourgoin had been interviewed by another doctor while he was still in the hospital, correct?
There's reference to another doctor,
Dr. Linder,
a psychologist, I believe.
is that your understanding that it was a psychologist?
I don't know Dr. Linder. I think he's a psychologist.
Okay. And it's clear from the transcript that he talked to Dr. Linder about the crashes that Mr. Bourgoin did, correct?
I don't know that.
Well, do you recall in the interview with Jamie Lee Kiley that Mr. Bourgoin says that Dr. Linder confronted him on some of his inconsistent statements?
Yeah, I don't know if what Dr. Linder talked to him about.
And you don't know what he talked to him about because you weren't given that information, correct?
I don't even know whether it was a competency exam.
Okay. And based on your finding that Mr. Bourgoin was psychotic up to 30 days after the crash, Dr. Linder would have spoke with him while he was still psychotic, correct?
I don't know that.
Well,
I don't know.
If
well,
Dr. Linder spoke with him while he was still in the hospital, and he was in the hospital until the 17th, he was in rehab until the 20th,
Yes, that would have made sense. Sure.
so he
Yes.
would still
Sure.
have been psychotic.
Yeah, sure.
And again, you were not provided with any of the statements that he made to Dr. Linder.
I wasn't told anything about Dr. Linder.
You have a fair amount of conversation in your two interviews with Mr. Bourgoin about the week leading up to the crashes.
Yes.
Okay. And during the first interview, Mr. Bourgoin makes statements indicating that before the crashes, the week leading up to the crashes, he was isolating himself. Is that your recollection?
Well, he was isolating himself, except he went out to meals with the Kosovics twice. He also tells me that.
Okay. And he also makes statements that he was having difficulty sleeping and maintaining sleep,
Yes,
and that he wasn't eating much.
yes,
And although he did deny suicidal thoughts, he admitted to having these morbid thoughts that you spoke about on direct, that everything that made life worth living had been taken from him.
yes,
And so what is the value of living?
yes, he had those morbid thoughts.
And you relied on all of these statements as part of your ultimate opinion, correct?
I try to write my reports taking into account the totality of the information, both from him, from other doctors, from medical records, cell phone records, everything. I try to take it all.
The statements that I just asked you about, did you use all of those statements to come to your ultimate
I
opinion?
considered them, yeah, sure.
And in both interviews, he provided a substantial amount of detail about the days leading up to the crash, right? The couple of days before.
Well, not just detail and uncertainties,
Right.
both.
So he states that starting on Wednesday is when things really started to get paranoid for him.
He thinks so. He thinks those days are correct.
You said on direct that this is when he starts doing a lot of research about Colin Kaepernick and Snowden and hacking and government stuff.
No, Colin Kaepernick was before that.
Okay.
Colin Kaepernick was a couple days before that, where he was disagreeing on some chat room about the anthem business, and he was taking the side that players should, stand for the anthem. And I think that he was actually found out subsequently that he was interacting with someone who was connected with Chrissy Gleason, his co-employee, named Mike Phillips. And I believe that Mike Phillips, he was told, was being investigated by the FBI, which sort of added on to his concerns. So, but the Colin Kaepernick stuff was a couple days earlier, before he starts getting into this stuff.
Okay. So it was the week before the crashes. He's doing a lot of research and Googling about Colin Kaepernick.
Some days before he goes full-fledged into the psychosis.
And at some point, he's doing a lot of research about government conspiracies and hacking, correct? He tells you that?
That gets closer to the Wednesday-ish time, yes.
Okay. And you're aware that when all of this is happening, this is a month before the 2016 election, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And so he says that by Thursday, he's very paranoid, and I believe in direct you said that at that point he's totally psychotic.
Well, he was psychotic.
Okay. And he says that after he gets out of work on Thursday, he feels completely connected to whatever was going on through his radio and truck, and that there was GPS patterns directing him to go places, correct?
Songs on the radio, and then he had also was, before he got rid of his phone, looking at his phone and making inferences from his phone as well.
So devices.
Yeah, and the TV static, and the TV Morse code business, and his house being bugged, and even leading up to him thinking he had a device implanted in him.
And he says that on Friday, during the day, he leaves Lake Champlain Chocolates at lunch, he drives around, he comes back, he sees this mysterious truck, leaves again, and he tells you that he immediately calls Lake Champlain Chocolate and quits his job, correct?
That's his error.
That's what he told you, though, correct?
I don't know if he said immediately. I don't remember if it was immediately, but he says he believes he called Chrissy Gleason.
And quit his job.
Yes, he believes he made the call, but that's not correct.
He says that after he has lunch with Alan Kosovic and then goes home briefly before continuing to just drive around again, correct?
Yeah, and Alan Kosovic, I think that was when he was concerned about the Bible business on Thursday with Alan Kosovic, that he didn't have certain things in his Bible.
And he specifically tells you that on Friday night he is home doing a lot of computer research. Do you recall that?
I think that's correct.
And again, these statements that I've just talked about, these are some of the statements that you relied upon in coming to your opinion, correct?
Yes.
And he specifically tells you during your first interview with him that he made a trip to Montpelier and went to Capitol Plaza Hotel on Thursday night. Do you recall that?
He repeatedly said, and I put in my report, emphasizing it, that he's not sure if it was Thursday or Friday.
If I show you the transcript from the first interview, would that refresh your recollection about whether or not he's clear that it's Thursday?
At one point he's clear, but he also prefaced it by saying, these days aren't certain for me. When I went over this with him more than once, he's not sure if it was Thursday or Friday.
I'm going to ask you again, in your first interview with him, did he tell you that the trip to Montpelier was Thursday night?
Probably did at one of the times we went through it, yes.
And then in the second interview, he tells you that it was Friday night.
He tells me he's not sure, and I have the quote in my report if I can read it.
If that's your answer, that's your answer.
That's my answer.
But he tells you in the second interview that he specifically states in the second interview that the second event that happened that night, when he left Montpelier, he went to the Essex McDonald's and then the cornfield.
That's how he's trying to piece it together, but he also repeatedly says he's not, or at least one or two times, says he's not sure whether the event of Montpelier was Thursday or Friday.
But every single time he talks about that event being before he ends up in the cornfield. Is that correct?
I don't know if that's correct. I just know he's not sure about whether it was Thursday or Friday.
Okay. So if I tell you that in each of his interviews, he's very...
Objection, Your Honor. Approach. Sure.
Don't give it
Okay, so I've received a signal that this apparently would be a great time for a morning break. So we will take the morning break for 15 minutes, and then we'll resume. Again, the warning is to please not discuss the case with each other, but have a great break. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, 15-minute break. Okay, please be seated. And I think you're set to resume.
Thank you, Your Honor. So, Dr. Rosmarin, again, Mr. Bourgoin tells you in the second interview with you that he left Montpelier, came back to the Burlington area, and then went to McDonald's and then the cornfield. Is that correct?
Did he say it again, please?
That in your second interview with Mr. Bourgoin, he tells you that the second event that happened on Friday night was that he left Montpelier, came back to the Burlington area, went to the McDonald's, and then went to the cornfield. Is that correct?
I don't know if that's the order he said it. I know he went to the, I know he told me he had the pumpkin muffin when he went to the cornfield. I'm not sure if he said he left Montpelier before that. My understanding is he didn't.
Okay. So you're aware that that interview was transcribed, correct?
Yes.
And would it refresh your recollection of what he told you to review that transcript?
No, I'm happy to tell you, that's one of the things. I'm sure he said that as we were trying to explore the order of things. Yes, I'm sure that you have it transcribed correctly.
But you just stated that you do not believe he told you that.
No, as I wrote on page 37 of my report, over the course of the interviews, he was uncertain about the order of things. I infer he got the pumpkin muffin at McDonald's before he went to the cornfield because he says he had it. He's not sure whether he went to. He may have said he went there on the Thursday, right? But he also told me, in addition, that he wasn't sure whether this was Thursday or Friday that he went to Montpelier. And I pointed out twice in my report on top of page 37.
I understand that. I'm asking you whether if he told you in the second interview that he did go to Montpelier before he ended up in the cornfield.
I'm sure you have it. I don't have the transcript in front of me, but I'm sure you have it quoted correctly.
Okay, but he did tell you that he went to Montpelier first, and then he came back to Burlington, and eventually ended up in the cornfield with a pumpkin muffin.
I'm sure you have the transcript correct.
Okay, thank you. And he said that he went to McDonald's after Montpelier because the messages were telling him to get something pumpkin flavored.
Something, I think it was pumpkin spice. It was giving him some signal about pumpkin spice.
Okay. And so he gets this muffin, and then he goes to the cornfield, and he claims to you that he is in this cornfield and receiving information from his Facebook connection and following information he was receiving via Facebook and Facebook Messenger, correct?
Words to that effect, sure. Yeah.
And he specifically tells you that while he's running through this field, believing he's on a mission, he receives an instant message through Facebook from a childhood friend who would have no reason to be messaging him on a Friday night. But he responded to it because he thought it was part of the mission. Is that correct?
I think that was Mr. Whitney. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Mr. Bourgoin stated he was very suspicious of this person's Facebook account, correct?
Words to that effect. He didn't understand why he was hearing from this guy. I think he said that he thinks he may have not been very kind to him when they were in 8th grade or something like that.
That Mr. Bourgoin wasn't kind to him.
Yes.
in 8th grade.
Yeah.
And again, you relied on all these statements from Mr. Bourgoin as part of your finding that he was psychotic on that night.
Well, I considered them. I didn't rely on everything he told me exactly because he had some uncertainty about things. Like I came to learn, for example, that he didn't call Chrissy.
Dr. Rosmarin, I need you to just answer the question. If you,
I considered them.
Okay, thank you. And that because of the information that he was receiving through Facebook and Messenger and the helicopters in the air, those are the reasons that he crushes his phone and throws it in the water. Is that correct?
Some of the reasons.
And he also tells you that he throws this knife away that was important to him and he always carries on him, correct?
I don't remember if he said he always carried it, but it was important to him. He'd had it since the Army.
Okay. And he says that early Saturday morning he goes to the Kosovics' house. He tells you that he talks a little that Alan talks to him a little, but that Mr. Bourgoin wasn't talking very much. Is that your recollection?
Who tells me?
Mr. Bourgoin told you that when he went to the Kosovics at 4 in the morning, Alan was talking to him, but that Mr. Bourgoin was not talking to them very much.
I suppose he said that, I don't recall.
And again, as part of your finding, you considered Mr. Bourgoin's version of that interaction.
Yes, I considered it.
And as to the day of the incident and Mr. Bourgoin's visit to the emergency room, you claim that Mr. Bourgoin was fixated on the pain scale, correct? You wrote in your report.
Did I use the word fixated?
You did.
Yeah, that fixated, confused.
Is it your testimony that fixated and confused are the same thing?
Well, he paid it inappropriate attention. Usually, that's a 1 second. You know, what's your pain?
Okay.
0, 5, 8, 10, and the nurse takes pains to say he's trying to understand it, and he's so fixated is
Thank you.
what I think he happened.
And it's your opinion that the physician's assistant that Mr. Bourgoin spoke with, Ms. P.A. McNee, did not understand why Mr. Bourgoin did not want to part with his clothes, correct?
She did not know that he had fear of being separated from his passport.
It's your testimony that she didn't know that he was afraid of being separated from his passport.
He may have said something to her, but she didn't know why is really the issue.
Okay. And he told you that he wanted to keep his clothes because he had his passport in his pocket, correct? Or on him?
He told me that?
Yes.
He told me, I don't remember exactly how he phrased it, but he didn't want to be separated from the passport.
Okay. And he told Ms. Kiley in the interview that they had that he also believes he had his wallet in his belongings, correct?
I don't recall whether he said anything about his wallet.
And he also told Ms. Kiley that he had a pocket knife with him that he did not want to part with. Is that correct?
I don't recall that.
You stated multiple times on direct and in your report that the UVM Medical Center records don't capture Mr. Bourgoin's recollection of what happened between the parties. Is that fair?
They don't capture his psychotic mental state.
And you also have the opinion that he was allowed to abruptly elope, correct?
Yes.
And again, all of these opinions were considered as part of your ultimate finding that he was insane on October 8th.
I consider that, yes.
And even from his statements to you and Ms. Kiley, he only says that he told staff he wanted a safe place to be and that he wasn't sleeping a lot and he was having anxiety and depression. Is that correct?
Trying to remember, I believe the record says he also, maybe P.A. McNee also said something that he had concerns about the girlfriend. And there was and I'm not sure if he said it to me or it's mentioned in the records or both.
Right, my question is that Mr. Bourgoin only ever tells you that that his only complaints to the ER staff was about not sleeping a lot and having anxiety and depression.
And wanting to be somewhere safe.
Wanting to be somewhere safe. And Mr. Bourgoin gave you a substantial amount of information regarding his daily activity leading up to the crashes. Again, we've talked about this a little bit. He has a fairly clear recollection that he leaves UVM Medical Center the morning of the crash and goes home, correct?
That's what he thinks, yes.
And he believes that he must have smoked more hash oil when he got home because he fell asleep. Is that correct?
That's his supposition. He says, I couldn't sleep without it, and I did fall asleep, so I must have. But he also says, I don't understand how I could have because I had ditched all the stuff the day before.
But he tells you that he believes he went home and he smoked more hash oil.
Well, believes is a misleading doesn't really capture what he told me. He says he must have because he can't understand how he otherwise could have fallen asleep.
Okay, thank you. And after that, he has little to no memory of the time that he got home from the time that he left again that night.
He knows that he came home during daylight hours and left after dark.
Okay. And at one point, he tells you that the next thing he remembers is hitting another car on the highway, correct?
That was one of his versions of his recall to me, yes.
And initially says he doesn't remember much else about
In
it.
one of his versions, that's how he describes it.
And then you ask him if he recalls driving that night, and he tells you that he recalls driving head-on against other vehicles and remembers recognizing that he was driving the wrong way and told himself to turn around and go the right way. Is that correct?
Are we referring to the first accident or the second?
That's not my question.
Oh, I'm not understanding your question then.
When you ask him if he recalls driving that night, that was your question to him. He states that he recalls driving head-on against other vehicles, that he remembers recognizing that he was driving the wrong way, and told himself to turn around and go the right way.
Yeah, I just don't understand if you're referring to the first accident or the second accident.
That's not my question, Dr. Rosemary. My question is when you ask him if he recalls driving that night, you don't ask him which crash he's talking about. You ask if he recalls driving, and that is his response to you. Do you recall that?
I recall I asked him about these things in order, and I'm not sure, again, I know he said that, but I'm not sure if he's saying that, if that is with regard to the first or the second or both crashes.
And do you have, where it's, in all of the times that you asked him about the difference in the crashes, he never tells you whether he's referring to this first crash or the second crash when he makes that statement. Is that correct?
I think I'm understanding it because I'm proceeding
Right.
chronologically with him, putting order into the examples. I want to understand it. So however I phrased it in my report is that I think I understood the context of where we were going, what
Right.
happened, So if I'm asking him about his driving right after he's, wakes up and he knows it's dark, that would have been the first crash.
Right, so you made the assumption and testified on direct and just now that this was related to the second crash, but he never says that, correct?
Again, I'd have to see the transcript. It was clear to me as I wrote it at the time what the context of my questions are.
Okay. And when he's interviewed by Ms. Kiley on November 21st, he tells her that his recollection is extremely clear on every part of it, correct?
I believe he said that to her.
And he tells her that he doesn't remember everything at the hospital, but he does have a very clear recollection all the way up until the ambulance ride to the hospital.
Uh-huh.
Mr. Bourgoin never states to you that the messages he was receiving through lights, radio, or any other devices told him to get on the interstate the right way, turn around, and go the wrong way, correct?
They never told him anything. He inferred from their patterns.
The question is the same. Did those patterns, lights, messages ever infer to him that he was to get on the interstate the right way, turn around, and go the wrong way on the interstate?
I don't think he's able, and I was able to get into that level of granularity. He just explained that he was following the directions of the radios and the lights and and other parts of the environment,
But he gives you those.
but not a direct order. He never claimed to get a direct order.
He gives you all of those same details for all of these other trips he's taking all around the place, correct?
Yes.
But he never gives you those details about the crash that we're here for, correct?
No, that's not correct. He gives a consistent account that he's getting directions which way to turn in the days leading up to the crash, where he's driving all over the place, and the same thing was happening with more intensity and more franticness and more terror
Okay. And
as
with-
days proceeded.
With regard to the car in the median, after the first crash, Mr. Bourgoin claims to have gone down to the car and opened the driver's side door, correct?
Whether he opened the door or not, I don't recall, but he went and viewed the mannequins, what he thought were mannequins burning.
Would refreshing your recollection on the first interview as to whether he said he opened the driver's door, would that refresh your recollection?
Certainly.
So I'll show you what's been marked as States 96. First I'll ask you, do you recognize that?
This is a transcript of my examination.
The first one?
Yes.
So if I'll show you on top of page 47, if you could read that top section
Sure.
to yourself, and then let me know if that refreshes your recollection.
Yeah, I think I've quoted most of this in my report, yeah.
Okay. So did he tell you that he ran down to the median and opened the driver's side door?
That's what it says.
That's what Mr. Bourgoin said,
Yes.
correct? And again, you relied on, or you considered all of these statements as part of your ultimate finding.
Certainly.
Now, as to the police cruiser that Mr. Bourgoin stole, he told you that after going into the median, he remembers coming up to the roadway and there just being a car sitting there, running and empty, correct?
I think he also used the words, quote, "so soon,"
Right.
unquote.
So soon. And he stated to you that he didn't know it was a cop car and that it could have been any car, it could have just as easily been a dump truck or a bus, correct?
Yes, he says that.
And again, you relied or considered those statements as part of your ultimate finding.
I did.
And you explained Mr. Bourgoin's behavior to the jury yesterday in Officer Shepard's cruiser video. You explained that as being due to extreme pain and his extreme head injuries. Do you recall that?
In part, yes.
But you actually have no way of knowing what injuries he had after the first crash, do you?
After the first crash,
Right.
he just said it felt like he had been hit, like he was helmet-to-helmet contact was his
Okay.
description.
Correct. You do not know what his injuries were at the time that he's shown in Officer Shepard's video.
Correct, I don't.
And after he steals the cruiser and is heading south in the right direction, he tells you that there's a lot of lights on within the vehicle and that he pressed all the buttons that were lit. Do you remember that?
I know he pressed a bunch of buttons. I don't know if they were all the buttons, but yes.
Okay. Yesterday on direct, you stated he was pushing the buttons or toggle or something. Do you recall saying that?
Then I said it might have been a toggle?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know what the buttons were like.
So that's the only reason that you have now added toggle to your statement of what he was pushing or touching in the cruiser?
Yeah, I have
video?
no idea what the inside of a police car is like, toggles or buttons.
So you are not aware of any evidence the jury has heard about a toggle in the police cruiser?
No, I don't know anything about any toggles.
Okay. And so just to be clear, Mr. Bourgoin never mentioned to you anything about a toggle in a police cruiser?
I don't know if toggles, buttons. I think that was just my way of thinking what switches are like in a police cruiser,
Okay.
trying to summarize what he's saying.
But he only ever said, I pressed the buttons that were
I think so.
lit." And he tells you that he was in fact listening to the radio traffic in the police cruiser, right?
Well, he says he's listened to the radio, and if I recall, as the cruiser was driving, Shepard's cruiser was driving, there was both the police And if I recall, the audio also had Western music playing both. But if I recall, as Shepard was driving to the accident, might have been DeFiore. I'm a little vague on that. One of the two cruisers had Western music playing along with the police radio.
So again, my question is, did Mr. Bourgoin tell you that he was listening to the radio traffic?
I don't know if he said traffic, but anyway, radio.
And did you specify to him music radio? And he said no, the police radio.
Oh, okay, yes, thank you.
And you stated something on direct today, and I believe yesterday as well, about Officer DeFiore shouting things at Mr. Bourgoin while he was in custody on the ground after the second crash.
I believe it was Officer DeFiore, yes, before the microphone stopped recording, yeah, on his body.
And you acknowledge that Mr. Bourgoin has never told you he heard anybody saying mean things to him at the scene?
No, he never mentioned it, no.
And that would be consistent with the trooper, Brad Miller, who was standing right next to Mr. Bourgoin, saying he never heard Officer DeFiore say anything to them, correct?
Well, I heard it on the audio. So I
You
presume Mr.
understand that
Bourgoin
the
heard it.
audio is on Officer DeFiore, correct? It's not on Mr. Bourgoin or anywhere near Mr. Bourgoin, correct?
Well, I thought DeFiore was close to Mr. Bourgoin, and it would be plainly audible.
Do you know how close he was to him?
Not exactly how close.
And you also used that reasoning to justify why Mr. Bourgoin attempted to get up, because he was scared because people were yelling mean things at him, correct?
That would have been a sensible reason for him to, as part of his fear. Plus, he had to get on with the. He's reacting to more lights. I believe he said he saw now white lights.
But the video actually shows that Officer DeFiore makes those comments because Mr. Bourgoin attempts to get up and run away, correct?
I can't tell you for sure, but I'm willing to accept that.
And the woman's voice that he heard in the ambulance, Mr. Bourgoin stated that he recognized her voice as being the one he was receiving messages from, correct? The presence.
He inferred that it was her voice. She testified that he said something to that effect, and she doesn't know him.
Right. And so again, the jury should probably pay attention to her testimony as to that interaction.
Well, she said that's what she said in her deposition.
Thank you. And again, you considered all of these statements as a part of your ultimate finding.
I did.
And you stated on direct that you believe there's evidence the defendant was actively psychotic for up to 30 days after the crashes, correct?
There was evidence of psychosis for about a month or so after the crashes.
And again, you've seen the medical records that were provided to you for his hospitalization after the crash?
Yes.
And again, Mr. Bourgoin told Ms. Kiley that while he was in the hospital, he believed his food and drinks were being drugged, correct?
Yes, he was afraid of getting opiates.
And he wasn't eating as much.
I don't remember whether he said he was eating as much, but I know he was afraid of getting opiates.
Okay. But when he arrives at the correctional facility on October 20th, he tells them that he wants to watch his weight because he says he's been eating a lot and not being very active. Correct?
What I remember from the notes in the correctional facility is that he's begging for more food because his weight has gone down from 195 to 175, and he's asking for double portions.
So if I was to show you the record that I'm referring to, would that refresh your recollection?
I'm sure he may have said whatever, but for the most part, what he's quoted is saying, I want
Dr.
more
Rosemary,
food, I'm hungry.
I'm asking you whether or not you recall that on the day he gets to jail, he makes a comment to them that he wants to watch his weight because he's been eating a lot.
I don't remember that, but it's actually that adds to my opinion that he's paranoid.
If I refresh your recollection with that piece of paper, would it help?
I believe you that he said that, but it adds to my impression that that's evidence that he was paranoid, just as he had been at the hospital.
And And on October 13th, he tells Dr. Runyon that he sometimes has suicidal ideation when he's in the middle of an argument, and that suicide is always an option, correct?
Yes, he said that.
And Dr. Runyon also states that the defendant's thought process and content was superficially organized and coherent, correct?
That's part of what Dr. Runyon said, yes.
And he also states that on October 14th, when he interacts with him, he does not find overt evidence of psychosis or mania on examination, correct?
That's part of what he says about psychosis, yes.
Dr. Kennedy, on October 16th, also interacts with Mr. Bourgoin and states that he has clear, organized thoughts, denied any perceptual disturbances, thought processing was intact, and described his behavior as being within normal limits, correct?
Part of the note, yes.
And on October 15th, Dr. Martin met with Mr. Bourgoin and stated he was alert, initially engaged, no evidence of thought distortion, correct?
Yes, she wrote a very brief note. That might have been all of it. I don't recall, but that's certainly close.
Well, she also states that he appeared clear, coherent, and cooperative with volitional periods of choosing to be silent.
Yes.
Correct? And on October 17th, Dr. Knackle notes that the patient is very reluctant to answer questions, but he was oriented. And when asked if he remembered his actions, he stated he remembered the full accident before and during and after, but would not elaborate otherwise.
That's what he said, and I think he was lying.
It's your opinion that these findings by the psychiatrist that saw him did not opine that he was actively psychotic because he didn't know who to trust, and so he was able to conceal these symptoms from them, correct?
That's what I think, and that's what Dr. Kapoor opined in her deposition.
And you, again, considered all of these statements in coming to your ultimate conclusion.
I did.
And again, on October 20th, Mr. Bourgoin is transferred to the correctional facility, and it's your opinion that there is support in those records to show he was still psychotic the first few weeks of incarceration.
I'm sorry, say that again. I didn't catch it.
You believe that there's evidence in the DOC records, the Department of Correction records, that would confirm that he was actively psychotic in the first few weeks he was there?
Well, there's a couple of notes that suggest it, and there are other notes that don't note it.
So you're making an opinion that because they don't note it, that they were leaving it out?
I'm not implying at all that it was intentionally they were leaving it out, that they didn't catch it.
And Mr. Bourgoin claimed in his interviews with you that he didn't know he had killed anyone until he was at the Fannie Allen Rehabilitation Facility, correct?
He said that in one of his versions, yes.
And he went to the rehabilitation facility on October 17th, correct?
Yes.
And he was arraigned on 5 counts of murder on October 14th, correct?
Yes.
And when you met with Mr. Bourgoin the second time, and he was asked about his belief that he'd had depression since he was a child, he explained his own symptoms to you and Dr. Lucas as sometimes having hyper or manic-y moods, correct?
I'll accept that that's an accurate quote, yes.
When you question him about why he would use those terms,
Yes.
correct?
Because I'm always skeptical when patients use psychiatric jargon.
Thank you. And your official diagnosis is bipolar 1 disorder in remission, correct?
Correct.
You also diagnosed him with cannabis use disorder and caffeine use disorder,
Yes.
correct? And Mr. Bourgoin...
And one
was
other
a-
diagnosis.
I'm sorry?
You left out the other diagnosis.
What was that?
Anxiety disorder not otherwise specified.
Okay. Mr. Bourgoin was a heavy marijuana user, correct?
Yes.
And you asked him a significant amount of questions around his history of marijuana use?
I did.
In fact, the entire purpose for your second interview with him was around marijuana use. Is that correct?
Entire would be distortion.
Most of it?
Substantial part of it.
You also focused a lot on his switch from green marijuana to THC oil.
Yes, I did.
And he had started using THC oil about 6 months before the crashes.
Yes.
And he admits, again, to ingesting oil at least up to the day before the crash, but in one interview ingesting it the day of the crash.
He's not certain about the day of the crash. It's a supposition on his part because he can't figure out how he suddenly got to sleep.
And Mr. Bourgoin is not currently receiving any medications that would tend to treat bipolar disorder, correct?
Well, again, I explained it a little more fully than that. He's not on an anti-mania medication, no, but he's on an antidepressant that would interfere with him getting depressive episodes, which is part of his cycle from depression to mania. That's his typical cycle.
Do you recall me asking you that same question in your deposition?
No.
Refresh your recollection to look at the transcript from that deposition?
Sure.
So I'll show you what is marked as States 98, on page 104, line 17.
Yes.
So when I asked you in your deposition if he was receiving any medications that would tend to treat bipolar disorder, your answer was correct.
Well, I said he's getting 2 antidepressants in the very next sentence.
Correct.
Well, that's what I think that 2 antidepressants are probably effective at.
And he's not currently manic, correct?
Correct.
And so he's never previously been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, correct?
Bipolar disorder?
Yes.
No.
And has not ingested any THC oil since he's been incarcerated, correct?
That's correct.
And he told you that when, in times before the crash, when he did not have any marijuana, he could become agitated and aggressive, correct?
At least agitated. I don't know about aggressive. And he had trouble sleeping, and he would be anxious. Depressed. I don't know if he used the word agitated, but definitely had trouble sleeping, and I guess irritable as well.
So if I showed you the interview where he says agitated and aggressive, would that refresh your recollection?
You don't have to show it to me, but I'm sure you're quoting it correct.
Okay. And it's your opinion that Mr. Bourgoin's chronic use of THC oil, potentially up to the morning of the crash, did not contribute in any way to the onset of this alleged psychosis. Is that correct?
I think if anything, it's a minor, but the predominant, by far predominant, was his bipolar disorder.
Thank you. And again, you mentioned on direct that you believe that Mr. Bourgoin could be motivated to lie, given the charges he's facing.
Any defendant can be motivated to lie.
Okay. And you stated that you didn't administer any malingering tests, correct? That you did not.
Did I do any psychological testing? I administered no psychological tests.
Okay. And in part, at least because the psychological test can only inform you of whether that person is malingering or lying at the time the tests are taken. Is that correct?
That's mostly true. So,
That's your...
well, I can't, that's not exactly the way, it's not a yes or no answer.
Well, again, did I ask you that same question in your deposition?
But the answer is, if you want the full truth here, is that's only mostly true with a little bit more context to it than that. And I'm happy to answer that if you want me to.
Well, I'll ask you again. Did I ask you that same question in your deposition?
Yes.
And would it refresh your recollection to see the answer you gave me then?
I believe that you have written it down correctly in the transcript.
That when I asked you that same question, your answer was right. And so in your assessment of whether he was lying to you, you looked for whether he had a practiced response, correct?
One of the things, yes.
You also looked for inconsistencies in his story that were only self-serving, correct?
One of the things, yes.
And you stated on direct with regards to believing Mr. Bourgoin that either he's extremely sophisticated and has researched how delusions start, or he's being truthful. Do you recall that?
Researched and is expert in recounting it, yes.
you never asked him whether he's ever researched delusions, correct?
No, I have not.
And in any of the inconsistencies, in some of the inconsistencies that have already come up, you have stated that could be from his head trauma, correct?
Well, not only from his head trauma, because that's the nature of memory. Memory is not a videotape. Memory gets altered simply by remembering it, and there's a lot of evidence about that. And some of his memory would have been contaminated by him getting external information and being asked about the same things, and plus his memory with everybody has been, in parts of it, blanks, and parts of it, I'm not sure. That's the, he says, I'm not sure. For example, the Thursday, Friday aspect.
Dr. Rosemary, my question was, you also believe that some of the inconsistencies in his memory are from possible head trauma. Can you just answer that?
Could have been, yes.
Okay. And again, because of all of that, you believe it's important to review potential corroborating evidence to support his statements, correct?
Important to get all the data and consider all the totality of the information, yes.
And it's your opinion that on Friday night, when the defendant was in the cornfield experiencing these delusions, he threw his phone and the knife in the river as a way to preserve his own life. Is that correct?
I think the knife was at the directions. The knife was first, and then he came back to the stream. I reviewed it last night after, because I didn't recall what he had said, so I now reviewed what he told me. The knife was first, at the first time he was at the stream, and the cell phone, I think, was at the second time he was at the stream.
The question is whether or not those were done to preserve his life.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. But the very next night, he's driving on the interstate at high rates of speed against oncoming traffic, correct?
Yes.
And that is not life-preserving, correct?
No, that is not life-preserving at all.
And one of your justifications for this first crash not being a suicide attempt is because the defendant was not wearing a seatbelt, correct? Or was wearing his seatbelt?
That's one of them. The police report said he was wearing a seatbelt.
Yes. And shortly after he steals the cop car, he drives until he sees another cop in a median, turns the cop car around, drives back in the wrong direction again, crashes into his own truck going 107 miles per hour, correct?
I don't know what he saw, but I know he made the turn and then drove back at extremely high rates.
Okay. And again, that is not life-preserving behavior, correct?
That is the actions of a terrified, disorganized man.
Are those actions life-preserving?
They are almost certain death.
And in that crash, he is not wearing his seatbelt, correct?
I don't think so.
That's all I have.
Any redirect?
Ms. George asked you about, during your second interview, that Mr. Bourgoin talked about being aware of driving the wrong way, and he was leaving in and out, and the cars were coming. You remember that?
Yes.
Okay. And there was a question about which crash he was talking about. Would reviewing the transcript of that refresh your recollection about which crash he was talking about?
Sure.
Showing you Defendant's Exhibit W, which is your evaluation of April 23rd. If you just could, for yourself, read from maybe halfway down page 228 on to 229.
Yeah, he's talking about the second crash.
So when he's talking about driving in and out of cars, knowing feels like he's going the wrong way, and then turns around. He's talking about his memory of what happened with the police cruiser.
Correct.
Because I think you testified, Ms. George, that you were going through things sequentially. So now, does that refresh your recollection that you were going through sequentially, and it's when he was... So, Ms. George also asked you about his memory of what went on during the period of time after he left his residence that evening, and kind of the drive that he had after he left his residence. Do you remember about that?
We're talking about late Saturday night?
Correct. Do you remember she asked you about that?
Yes.
Okay. Do you remember that in your interviews with him about that, he didn't have much of a memory about what went on?
Your Honor, Mr. Kadam's questions are leading questions.
This is really a preliminary question.
Yeah, so I think it's preliminary, so I'll overrule it.
Do you remember whether he gave more detail about that to Ms. Kiley when she gave the initial interview with him back in November of 2016?
Yes, I believe I commented on that in my report, that his memory was better closer in time when Ms. Kiley interviewed him.
Would reviewing what he said to Ms. Kiley about that period of time refresh your recollection about what he said about what he was doing as far as driving on that day?
Sure.
Should have just remarked and asked for identification.
What is X?
I'm sorry. It's the interview with Ms. Kiley from November 23rd, 2016 of Mr. Bourgoin.
Okay.
Just start on page 191 at the top and read that to yourself and come to that question or recollection about what Mr. Bourgoin told Ms. Kiley about what was going on with him driving with
What page is it?
Okay.
191, I believe.
Okay.
Does that refresh your recollection about what he told Ms. Kiley about what was going on?
Yes.
And what did he tell Ms. Kiley?
Well, the last sentence of what he told her says he didn't, he's
Your
following
Honor.
the directions.
I would object to him reading it out of the...
He tells her that he's following these directions. He thinks there's this eye in the sky following him. He's going. When he's going fast, his signals say to slow down. When he slows down, the signals say to speed up, and that he doesn't see the other car coming completely, and that's what that passage says.
And does he tell Ms. Kiley if he tried to do anything with regard to this oncoming car?
Not there, not on page 192.
Does he relate during that interview with Ms. Kiley that he has an awareness of driving the wrong way on the highway?
Can I see it again, please? Well, sorry, that's on subsequent pages. I didn't look there.
Just let me know when you're done.
Can you repeat the question?
He talks to Ms. Kiley about, if you can put the document down. He talks to Ms. Kiley about his memory of what went on prior to the crash.
Yes.
And that's different than what he told you and Dr. Kapoor and Dr. Cotton, correct?
More detail.
And the question was, from your memory, did he, and from reviewing that, does that refresh your recollection about what the details were with regard to moments before the crash? Did he have an awareness that he was driving the wrong way on the highway?
No.
Ms. George asked you about some inconsistencies or chronological parts of Mr. Bourgoin's statements to you. So do any of them that you're aware that there were a number of them?
I'd be surprised if there wasn't.
And do any of those cause you to doubt your opinion of the case?
Well, I consider them, but I think that the fact that they come out in the normal way, the way people remember things over time, with uncertainties and lack of clarity about the order of certain things, that's consistent with recounting the best one can.
And one that she talked to you about is this Thursday, Friday trip to Montpelier, correct?
Yes.
And I think Ms. George said to you that in the first interview, he only said it was on Thursday. But would reviewing the transcript of that interview refresh your recollection about whether or not he had said Thursday, Friday, even during the first interview?
Multiple times we went over this, and as I quoted him, or as I quoted him, or I wrote in my report, he wasn't certain whether it was Thursday or Friday.
But specifically with regard to the first interview, would it refresh your recollection to see a transcript of the first interview to tell us whether he even said that Thursday, Friday on his first interview?
Sure.
Your Honor, I would object. I feel like this is asked and answered. He's been pretty clear about his memory of the interviews.
I think Mr. Kadams can redirect on this.
So I'm showing you what's marked as Defendant's Exhibit B, the transcript of your February interview. If you could refer to the end of page 110 into 111, and tell me if that refreshes your recollection about this Thursday, Friday business.
Yeah, he says that he's not sure in that
Doctor,
first...
the question
I'm
is,
sorry,
does
I
it
was-
refresh your memory?
Oh, yes, it refreshes my memory.
Thank
Okay.
you. Next question.
And what, did he say during the first interview that he wasn't sure whether it was Thursday or Friday?
He did, said those words.
Would it make a difference to your overall opinion whether Mr. Bourgoin had contacted Mr. Whitney on Friday night or Mr. Whitney had contacted Mr. Bourgoin?
Certainly not.
Why not?
It's irrelevant. It's his best memory. It's the same as he thought he had called his boss, Chrissy, to resign, and she called him. What he remembers is a conversation, and whether he dialed her or she dialed him, it's irrelevant, in my opinion.
And Ms. George asked you some questions about Mr. Bourgoin's version of what happened at the Kosovix at 4 o'clock in the morning between Friday and Saturday. You remember that?
Yes.
Did you also have other information did you also review other information about what went on during that 4 a.m. Visit from other sources?
From ASEMA, primarily.
And what did ASEMA report about that visit with Mr.
She
Bourgoin?
testified that, she was very concerned about him and something wrong with him. She'd never seen him like that.
So let's talk a little bit about the issue of marijuana. So do you have an opinion about whether or not this event was some type of THC, marijuana-induced psychosis?
I have opinion it wasn't.
And did you investigate that?
Very carefully.
Okay, and how did you go about doing that?
I took a careful history from him. I asked Dr. Lucas, who's even more knowledgeable about marijuana than I am, to help me evaluate him and discuss the case with Dr. Lucas in detail. And I combined Dr. Lucas's knowledge of toxicology, Dr. Lucas's experience of administering extremely high doses of marijuana to people, thousands of them in his lab, with my clinical experience, and considered all the reasons that marijuana was not the cause of his manic psychosis.
Okay, and what are those? What are the reasons why you and did Dr. Lucas concur?
Yes.
He's not a psychiatrist, though.
He's a toxicologist who evaluates psychiatric patients. He's very careful and formal about that.
And so why did you conclude this wasn't a marijuana-induced psychosis?
I can do a bunch from memory, but if I could also refresh my memory from my report, it would help me not miss any.
Coach, I'm showing you what's marked as defendant exhibit K, so review what you need to review, and then go to the report and answer the question.
Well, the first thing is that he had been using the first thing is he has a mood disorder. And that I've testified to in detail that would be the primary cause. The second reason is that lots of patients use marijuana to do the things he describes. And it's typical, as opposed to atypical, that patients who have mood disorders, many of them, use marijuana to help them relax, help them get to sleep. Third reason is that he had used this alternate method of obtaining THC for 6 months without intensifying his use. So he used the marijuana as a sedative, a calming agent, and marijuana is a depressant. He hadn't gotten manic when he was on things that are known to be causing psychosis, such as cocaine when he had used it remotely. Marijuana is a depressant. It's not an activating medication. In addition, he used it not to get high. He had always talked about that, and he had been straightforward with his doctors about it, and it's in the medical records, that he used it because it helped him with anxiety, helped him with his sleep, helped him some with his physical pains, and he did not go out and party with it. He used a little bit before work, a little bit after work, and a bit to go to sleep. And his employers said that until the very week of the accident, that he functioned well. He was known to be extremely, detail-oriented and excellent in his IT portion. So that didn't impair him. So they have that long history of it not impairing him. His blood levels of when they were taken 5 hours after the crash were low. And Dr. Lucas talks about administering hundreds of, he had 10 nanograms per ml in his blood. Dr. Lucas administers to people 2,000 nanograms per ml and doesn't make them psychotic in his lab. And these are patients with mental illness. And that goes with the literature. His levels were consistent with what his story was. They were low, and those were the levels in his blood, not in his brain. Those are different. What's in your brain is what's in your cerebrospinal fluid. These are low. These are consistent with someone who had chronically used and hadn't used in the past day or so, which was consistent with his story. If he had used recently to the time of the accident, they would have been higher. Let me see if I've left any things out about that. Oh, and finally, he had some degree of psychosis for a month after his last use, which again supports the fact that so when people have problems from marijuana and distorted thoughts from marijuana, they go away in a couple hours. And he's still having problems, paranoid, and thinking he can signal his captors or his government with what he chooses on the menu days after his last use. So for all those reasons, I think the marijuana is not a significant contributor to his manic psychosis. And marijuana doesn't cause mania. It's a depressant.
Are you aware that Dr. Cotton at some point makes an opinion about this might be some type of event caused by marijuana withdrawal?
Yeah, there's nothing in the literature to support that. It's just not medically valid. People don't get that. They get a little bit irritable. Their sleep can get a little... When people who are chronic marijuana users stop marijuana, they can be a little bit irritable. And we heard testimony about that, and he even says it. And Anila says it. And that's true. And when he didn't have it, when he didn't have it, the underlying illness comes through, which is the sleep disorder. Yes, that comes through because he used it to treat the sleep disorder. It was sedating to him. It wasn't mood elevating.
Is the manic episode that he experienced on that Saturday evening part of your bipolar diagnosis?
Yes.
So, Ms. George asked you, had he ever been diagnosed with bipolar prior to October 8th?
Right.
So, if he hadn't had a manic period, would somebody be able to diagnose him with bipolar?
Yeah, so again, as I had mentioned earlier, people don't come in complaining saying, hey, I have all this energy and I'm good till 3 in the morning all the time when I have those episodes. People like their hypomania. It's just that under the stressors that he was going through then, and when he went from his depression, this time he flipped into full-blown mania, and that's typical. People can have years of hypomanic episodes before having a manic switch. It's typical. We see it all the time.
You didn't do any, or have anybody do any psychological testing, correct?
No, I did not.
But you were aware there was some psychological testing done in this case, correct?
Yes.
And do you know by whom?
By a psychologist who I've had work on cases with me, who I think the world of, Dr. Baranowski.
And you talked about his memory and how memory works. Would being manic, could that affect somebody's memory?
When you're psychotic and manic, it can impair your recall of events. It can jumble them, and people who are extremely psychotic can have really greatly impaired memory in portions, yes.
I don't have anything else to say.
Very briefly.
Dr. Rosmarin, I just want to be clear on a couple of things. And first, the inferences that he was hearing from lights, devices, radio, lights, never tell him, he never says to you that they told him to turn around on the interstate and go the wrong way, correct?
He did not have hallucinations. He didn't hallucinate. He never got
Dr.
direct
Rosmarin,
to tell him.
That's not my question.
Okay, I thought you said tell him.
The inferences is what I said. He was never inferred from these messages that he was to turn around on the interstate and go the wrong way. Is that correct?
Turn around and go the wrong way in the second crash?
No, in the first crash. He gets on the interstate the right way. He never tells you that any message or anything told him to turn around or inferred that he should turn around and go the wrong way.
My understanding is it was an ongoing process that didn't stop. It
Right.
continued those moments days before and days after.
My question to you is whether, or not even whether, he never told you that these lights, devices, inferred that he should turn around and go the wrong way.
He said it was controlling all of his driving, so I didn't get into that. I didn't ask him that question exactly the way you're quoting it, but he said it was controlling all of his driving.
And when describing that he acknowledges that he was going the wrong way, he describes weaving in and out of vehicles that were driving head on to me, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And with regards to the Facebook message that he receives when he's in this cornfield, Mr. Kadams asked you whether it made any difference to you that it was in fact Mr. Bourgoin that initiated that conversation. You said that it did not, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And so it also does not matter to you that in this message that Mr. Bourgoin claims is part of the reason he smashes his phone and throws it into the water, the message that he sends to this person is, you have hot friends.
Yeah.
And that also does not make any difference in your opinion, correct?
It does make a difference in my opinion, which is he further said, he explained it to me and said, or he explained that the reason it was of concern from him is, who is this guy and how come I'm connecting with him? It was part of his confusion about all the sources that were connecting with him, from his television to people in his remote past. He's trying to process this.
He's trying to process.
Why he called Chris Whitney, I have no idea.
He's trying to process why he initiated a conversation with a high school friend who has pictures on his Facebook of good-looking people and says to him, you have hot friends, correct?
Correct.
All set?
Nothing further, Judge, sorry.
You can step down.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. So is there another witness lined up, or?
Yes, we have other witnesses waiting. I think we can either wait till after lunch or squeeze one in before.
So how's the jury feeling? We could break for lunch now and start at 1 o'clock, or we can keep going for 15 more? Keep going. Keep going. Clear signal. Keep going.
The defense would call Margie McLaren.
Morning.
Solely for the evidence you shall give, relative to the cause and all other consideration, shall be the whole truth and nothing but the truth and the means of first degree.
Yes.
Okay, please sit, bring your chair forward and speak into the microphone. Speak up.
Good morning. Please state your name and spell your last name for the record.
Margaret McLaren, M-C-L-A-R-E-N,
And where do you work?
at the University of Vermont Medical Center
And in what department?
in the emergency department.
And what do you do there?
I am a registered nurse.
And I'd like to talk to you about an incident that occurred on October 8th, 2016. Were you working that day?
I was.
And did you report a suspicious incident to security that day?
Yes.
And can you tell us what happened?
I was in our break room, which is separate from the clinical area, and I was with two other individuals. We went to leave the break room. The door opens inward, and the first person to open the door, and there was a man standing in the doorway, slightly off to one side. The two people I was with went past him. I stepped through the door and pulled the door shut behind me to make sure it closed all the way. And then turned to this individual and said, or me or one of the other two people I was with, I'm not sure, someone asked him, could we help you? And he said, no, I'm looking at this poster, and we walked away. I then went to security and reported that there was an individual in a private part of the department, or a non-public part of the department.
Okay. And when you opened the door, did Mr. Bourgoin step back?
Not really.
Okay. And did you find this unusual?
Yes,
Okay. And why was that?
because when I stepped through the door, he was maybe 6 or 7 inches away from me and hadn't stepped back the way people typically do when someone's coming out of a door or an elevator that you're trying to get into.
And do you remember about what time this happened?
I start work at 7. It was earlier in the day.
And you briefly mentioned this, but where in the ER did you encounter Mr. Bourgoin?
All the administrative offices are in a hallway, and as well as the door to our break room. It is a hallway that you need to access either by pressing a button or security lets you in, or using your badge to open the door.
So this is past security,
Correct.
and it's not a public hallway?
Correct.
And so you did report this to security?
Yes.
I don't have any other questions. Thank you.
Any cross?
Just briefly. Good morning, Ms. McLaren. This male that you saw, was there anything unusual about his appearance?
No.
What about his demeanor? What was that like?
He said one sentence, which was, "I'm looking at this poster," or "I'm just looking at this." He spoke in a normal tone of voice.
So nothing unusual about him?
Nothing unusual in his appearance or demeanor.
And in this hallway in the administrative offices, there are posters on the walls, correct?
Yes.
And people are encouraged to look at those posters that are on these walls.
Yes, they're mostly posters for staff about educational opportunities, that kind of thing.
Right. And isn't it true that this hallway is patients are sometimes permitted to walk through this hallway to get to the ED?
It is one of the ways, if you're coming from the parking garage, to get into our department, and that's where security lets you in. They ask your business, and you say, "I'm trying to get somewhere," and they let you in.
Okay. And so you weren't concerned about the fact that he was in a non-public area. People do this, right? People do show up there
Yes.
from time to time. Okay. So the only real suspicion you had that made you suspicious at all was that he didn't step back when you opened the door?
He didn't, that's right, he didn't step back, and he couldn't give me a good reason for being there.
Did he give you any reason whatsoever?
He said, "I'm looking at this poster."
Do you know what poster it was?
Somebody had lost a sweatshirt, and they hung a poster up on our break room door.
Okay, thank you.
Any redirect?
No, thank you.
Okay, you're all set. Thank you.
Call Joseph O'Connor, Your Honor.
solemnly affirm the evidence you shall give relative to the cause under consideration shall be the whole truth and nothing but the truth as it is and is the version. Please be seated. Pull your chair forward, speak into the microphone.
State your name for the record and spell your last name, please.
Joseph O'Connor, and it's spelled Oconor.
Okay. And where are you employed?
University of Vermont Medical Center,
And what's your position there?
security officer.
Okay. And were you so employed back in October of 2016?
Yes, I was.
And did you have an occasion on October 8th, 2016, around 8:15 in the morning, 8:30 in the morning, respond to an incident at the hospital?
Yes, I did.
And so I want to ask you first to describe for me, if you could, a little bit of the layout back then in 2016 of kind of after you enter the emergency department, kind of describe the layout if you were facing right after you entered the emergency department.
From the exterior entrance?
Yeah, if you came from the exterior entrance, you walk through, I think there's sliding glass doors, is that correct?
There are now. I don't remember what the configuration was back then.
There's a door of some sort?
Yes.
Okay. So right when you come to the door, just describe to us what you would be looking at.
When you first come in, it will be a security desk, a registration desk, and 2 triage rooms.
And so the security desk is right next to the reception desk or the
Just
registration
behind it.
desk?
Just behind it.
Okay, just behind. And is there usually somebody at the security desk?
Yes.
And back then, in October of 2016, how many security folks would be in the emergency department at any given time?
2.
And as you faced the check-in area and the triage to the left, what's to the right? Is there anything to the right?
Back then, it was glass windows.
Is there a hallway that goes to kind of the executive area or break room in that area?
Yes, there is.
And where is that as you're facing, when you walk in and you're facing the security desk, where is that hallway?
Off to the right and around the corner.
Okay. And is there a security door there between the public and going into that executive area?
Yes, there is.
All right. And how about security footage? Is there, back then, was there cameras?
Yes.
Where were there cameras in the emergency? There's no cameras in the emergency rooms themselves, correct?
No, there are not.
Okay. But outside where are they as far as when you walk in, and how about the exterior around the emergency department?
There's multiple cameras positioned inside and out.
Okay. And are those actively monitored
Yes.
by one of the 2 security guards that are on in the emergency department?
Yes.
And so back on October 8th, 2016, did you respond around 8:30 or so in the morning to someone about an incident?
Yes.
Okay. Do you remember what time it was?
Not exactly, no.
Okay. Did you write an incident report with regard to that incident?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Would looking at that incident report refresh your recollection about what time it was?
Absolutely.
Showing you what's been marking as Defendant's Exhibit Z for identification. And ask you if you can identify that.
That is my incident report.
Okay, so does looking at that refresh your recollection about what time you got called to an incident?
Yes.
What time was that?
08:40 and 31 seconds.
And how do you know kind of that exact time?
I had to go back and review footage to find out when I walked through the door.
Okay. Walk through what door?
There's a back door coming off the back emergency department hallway that enters into that executive hallway.
So you weren't at the security desk at the time you got the call?
No, it was not.
So you came from somewhere else in the hospital?
Yes.
And you see on the video that you're coming through, coming into that executive hallway at 8:40 and 31 seconds?
Yes.
Does that video exist, do you know?
I don't know how long the storage is.
So tell me, what was the report? Do you remember why you were called to the...
I was walking in that back hallway. I was approached by an RN in the emergency department.
You remember who?
I do.
Who's that?
Margie McLaren.
Okay. She was just in court just a minute ago? Okay. And what did she say to you?
There's a gentleman hanging out in the executive hallway.
So what did you do?
I went through those doors I had mentioned and encountered the individual at the end of the executive hallway.
Okay. Did you later figure out that person was Stephen Bourgoin?
Later, yes.
Okay. And so tell me what happened.
So he was standing in the hallway reading something on the wall. I don't remember exactly what. I approached him from behind, introduced myself, explained to me he couldn't be hanging out in that part of the hallway. He turned headwise and just, "I'm sorry, I'll just leave," and he walked down the hallway.
Did you see him again? Did you, no, strike that. That's all I have, Your Honor.
Good morning, Mr. O'Connor.
Morning.
If the person, the male that you were talking to, had indicated he needed some kind of help, would you have helped him?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
No further questions, Judge?
All set?
Yeah.
You can step down. Thank you.
Thank you. And probably a good time to break down here.
All right, so we're going to break for lunch at this point. We'll try to be ready to go at 1 o'clock, so have a great lunch. Don't discuss the case. Thank you.